Around 7,000 years ago, near Windover Pond, in east central Florida, a small hunter-gatherer community thrived. The climate back then was much drier and cooler than it is today. Sea levels were drastically lower because the Earth was still emerging from the last ice age. As a result, Windover Pond originally sat high above the local water table. It was a shallow depression, filled solely by rainfall and surface runoff, not the deep groundwater-fed pond it eventually became. The pond was once surrounded by a rich, diverse canopy consisting of at least 30 different tree species. This included hardwood hammocks featuring live oak, ash, American elm, and red mulberry. Pine woodlands and freshwater swamp trees like black gum and willow also thrived nearby. However, because the general climate was drier, arid-adapted species like prickly pear cactus, wild grapes, and various elderberries were highly abundant and made up a massive part of the inhabitants' diet. This is in contrast to modern Florida's humid, subtropical climate with high annual rainfall. Large land mammals like white-tailed deer were highly prevalent, and their bones and antlers were routinely used for projectile points and hooks. The peoples regularly made trips to the coast, leaving behind shark teeth and saltwater conch shells at the inland site. These people belonged to the early archaic period. Far from nomadic wanderers, they were highly skilled artisans, weavers, and healers. They moved with the seasons, and in late summer and early autumn, they set up camp near a shallow, peat-bottom pond. The pond they lived near served a sacred purpose. It was their cemetery. When a member of the tribe passed away, they were laid to rest within 48 hours. The living flexed the deceased body into a fetal position, gently placing them on their left side, facing west. The bodies were wrapped in complex fabric shrouds, the oldest ever found in the Americas. To keep them submerged in the tranquil waters, the tribe drove sharpened wooden stakes into the thick peat. Children were buried clutching cherished toys. A teenage boy crippled from birth by spina bifida was buried with the same meticulous care, proving a society anchored by deep compassion and collective care. Over the course of a millennium, more than 160 individuals were committed to the depths of this sacred pond. Then the tribe moved on, and the water guarded their secrets for the next 8,000 years. Fast forward to the spring of 1982, the ancient forest had vanished, replaced by the expanding footprint of modern Florida. Developers broke ground on a new housing community named Windover Farms. Backhoe operator Steve Vanderyacht paused to examine a pale rock he had uncovered while working construction near the edge of a pond at Windover Farms in Brevard County, Florida, near the intersection of State Road 50 and Interstate 95. Turning the object over in his hands, Vanderyacht saw two eye sockets and realized he was holding a human skull. What Vanderyacht did not know at the time was that he had stumbled across a prehistoric cemetery that would prove to be one of the most amazing archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. Developers Jack Eckerd and his stepson Jim Swan had planned for Windover Farms to become a housing development, serving the growing community of Titusville, Florida. Swan was intrigued by what else might be hidden beneath the layers of pond muck, and it would have remained a mystery if not for Swan's next decision, to call on archaeologist Glenn Doran. Doran was a young, up-and-coming professor at Florida State University in Tallahassee at the time, and although he was not the first archaeologist to visit Windover, he was the first to recognize the site's potential and to not be daunted by the challenges it presented. He was immediately fascinated by the age of the remains. Heavy wear on the teeth proved evidence of a prehistoric diet, but he did not have the funds to have them radiocarbon dated. Swan volunteered the money, and when the results of the testing came back, both men were astounded. The bones were over 7,000 years old, more than 2,000 years older than the Egyptian pyramids. Wet sites have yielded some of the most spectacular archaeological finds in the world. Prior to Windover's discovery, ancient human remains had been uncovered at 4 other sites in Florida. As mortuary ponds, these sites served as cemeteries during the early and middle archaic periods, roughly 10,000 to 5,000 years ago. These burials were preserved because of the remarkable properties of the substance in which they were submerged, peat. Made up of layer upon layer of decomposing organic materials, mainly vegetation, peat provided an oxygen, an acid-free environment that allowed bones and artifacts to survive for thousands of years. However, as soon as the materials are excavated and exposed to the air, they begin decomposing rapidly. This is one of the many factors that make wet site archaeology especially slow, expensive, and challenging. Doran recruited an old friend from college, archaeologist Dave Dickel, and they designed a demucking system that would remove enough water to excavate, but not too much. It was essential that the peat stay moist to protect the materials buried within. Over the course of 3 field seasons, in 1984, 1985, and 1986, Doran Dickel perfected the process. They installed 158 well points around the edge of the pond to capture water from both the top and bottom of the pond and eject it away from the site, creating an excavation area about the size of an Olympic swimming pool. Digging in peat was not like digging in soil. The peat had a clay-like consistency that had to be sliced using sharpened trowels and shovels. Excavating the site was described as digging through chocolate mousse underwater. Over 3 field seasons, the crew meticulously peeled back the layers of ancient muck. Thin layers were slowly shaved away until the peat changed color, a sign that archaeologists were nearing a burial. Then wooden tools were used to gently scrape away the muck from the remains. The most important tool was water. Bones can crack if they dry out too quickly, so archaeologists used spray bottles of water to keep the bones wet and to help remove adhered peat. Toward the end of the first field season, Doran and Dickel made an astounding discovery: a mushy, greasy, tan substance inside one of the skulls. Speculating on what the material might be, Doran joked that maybe it was only snail poop. But doctors at the University of Florida's Shands Medical Center soon confirmed that a sample was actually human brain tissue. By the end of that year, several intact brains had been recovered. Though shrunken to a quarter of their original size, they still retained the shape and surface features of a typical human brain. The unique, non-acidic, anaerobic peat environment had acted as a time capsule, shielding the organic matter from oxygen, bacteria, and decay. In total, 91 of the 186 recovered individuals contained surviving brain tissue. Though these were not the first ancient skulls found with preserved brain matter, this was the first time such a discovery coincided with advances in technology that would allow researchers to analyze the tissue on a molecular level. To ensure the preservation of the brain matter for future study, it was removed from the skulls in the field, sealed in nitrogen-filled containers at -4 degrees Fahrenheit, and transferred to the lab at the University of Florida, where the containers were frozen at -94 degrees. By comparing the DNA in these tissues with the genetic sequences of other populations, particularly mitochondrial DNA passed down maternally and Y chromosomal DNA passed down paternally, it is possible to trace the history of human migration. While researchers have determined that DNA did survive in the brain tissue, the samples are still extremely fragile. Instead, an analysis of DNA extracted from the skeletal remains has yielded the most interesting results. Conducted decades after the excavation, the study revealed that the people buried at Windover migrated to North America from Asia, but do not seem to be related to any living Native American tribes or to any known prehistoric peoples. This leaves one of 2 possibilities. Either their descendants died out, or their population bottlenecked before the genetic markers we find in modern humans evolved. The extractable DNA from the brains was among the oldest DNA ever successfully sequenced. The genetic markers reveal links to ancient Asian migration lineages, but bore no direct match to modern Native American groups. Despite the remarkable discovery of the intact brain matter, Doran and Dickel were initially disappointed by the results of their excavation. The finds uncovered during the first 2 field seasons in 1984 and 1985 were either too commingled or too isolated to draw many conclusions. But during the 3rd and final field season in 1986, as the team began digging in the northern part of the pond, they suddenly started finding undisturbed burials with distinct, nearly complete skeletons. This, according to the archaeologists, is when the graves began to speak. The story they tell begins 9,000 years ago, when ancient humans began using Windover as their cemetery. As the indigenous people moved through the area seasonally, they would bury their dead in the pond during late summer and early fall. We do not know where they lived the rest of the year, but we can tell from the level of decomposition that the bodies were interred within 48 hours after death, so they were probably living nearby during the autumn months. The bodies were tucked into a flexed position, bundled in fabric, along with a variety of grave goods, and submerged beneath the water, typically on their left sides, facing west. The remains rested about halfway down in the 20-foot deep deposit of peat. The heads were west of their pelvises, as if in deference to the setting sun. Wooden stakes driven through the cloth kept them anchored to the bottom of the pond. Generation after generation returned to the pond to bury their dead, in this manner for the next 1,000 years. This all may have been done to keep the bodies from floating to the surface, or to protect them from scavengers. Indeed, of more than 10,000 human elements recovered from the site, just 6 showed signs of having been gnawed by rodents or other creatures. Some stakes were notably larger than others. Experts say those bigger stakes may have marked off burial zones. Life in prehistoric Florida was not easy. The bones at Windover showed signs of numerous ailments, including disease, broken bones, and malnutrition. About half of the individuals died before the age of 18, and many more did not live past their late 40s. By that time, the high level of grit in their diet, caused by using stone tools and surfaces to prepare food, combined with the use of their teeth as tools, had worn their teeth down to nubs. Arthritis and abscesses were common as well. It makes sense then that several were found with large quantities of plant seeds known to have pain-relieving properties in their stomach region, potentially representing the first archaeological evidence of the medicinal use of plants. But make no mistake, despite the harshness of their environment, this was a society that spent significant amounts of time caring for their vulnerable. Children and teenagers who passed away were buried with more grave goods than were adults, indicating the high value placed on children. Skeletons included one of a male aged about 15 who had spina bifida. All of his bones were found to have been fragile. One of his feet was missing, and the stump of his lower leg had healed. As his spinal condition almost certainly meant the boy was paralyzed below the waist, this find was important for assessing the society's commitment to ensuring his survival for 15 years in a hunter-gatherer community. The people of Windover probably also splinted broken bones, performed amputations, and cared for their sick and elderly. Only one skeleton showed signs of violence, a young man with an antler tine embedded in his hip, and a missing skull. The artifacts buried with the bodies can tell us just as much as the remains themselves. In addition to a variety of wooden artifacts, archaeologists recovered 119 objects made from animal parts, many of which would have been used as tools to fish, hunt, and butcher meat. Deer antler was used to make projectile points and barbed fishing hooks. Scrapers and other tools were made from the teeth of sharks, opossums, and canids. Containers made of turtle shell, too small for use in cooking food, were possibly used to prepare medicinal plants. In one burial, archaeologists also found a bottle gourd that may have been used as a container. The oldest known example of a bottle gourd north of Mexico, this find may support the theory that some of the earliest cultivated plants in the New World were not sources of food, but utilitarian plants that provided light, durable containers and tools. Though very few stone artifacts were found, the points that were recovered can be traced to quarries in Sumter County, more than 80 miles away. In addition, awls, perforators, punches, and pins made from animal bones and antler would have been used in the preparation of hides, baskets, cordage, clothing, and other fabrics. Remarkably, 87 fragments from these hand-woven palm fiber textiles survived. Extremely fragile and nearly indistinguishable from the surrounding peat, the cloth had to be removed with the entire burial in a single, large block and transported back to the laboratory where specialists in preserving ancient fiber worked to carefully extract and conserve them. Although their production and use certainly predate Windover, these woven textiles represent the oldest surviving examples of this type in the New World. Not all of the grave goods had a utilitarian purpose. 3 necklaces adorned the neck of a woman in her early 20s, each made from a different material: fish vertebrae, sable palm seeds, and shells. 2 more were found draped over a 2-year-old. Garnering international fame, the archaeological finds at Windover were greeted by public demand for information so overwhelming that Doran was forced to hire a full-time communications specialist to respond to media inquiries, organize volunteers, and spearhead educational initiatives such as tours and school programs. The Brevard Artists Association even held a contest, challenging artists to produce the best Windover-inspired artwork, with Dickel, much to his dismay, to serve as the judge. By the end of the 3rd field season, Doran, Dickel, and their team had uncovered a minimum of 168 skeletons, including 91 with preserved brain tissue. It is the largest, most demographically diverse skeletal discovery from this time period in the New World, with ages ranging from the newborn to over 65 years old, and both sexes equally represented. Such a broad, well-preserved sample has allowed archaeologists to learn about prehistoric burial practices, life ways, health, migration, and much more, and the materials will continue to be studied for years to come as new technologies open up fresh avenues for research. Windover may also be one of the last prehistoric cemeteries ever excavated in the United States because several years later, federal and state laws were passed that protect indigenous human remains, funerary items, and sacred objects, a response to the long history of stripping Native Americans of their material culture. As the excavation concluded in late 1986, researchers had unearthed 168 bodies, dozens of perfectly preserved bone tools, and the oldest woven textiles in the New World. Some of the most important findings that were gleaned from the site by researchers are that early Floridians resided in a kind of sedentary hunter-gatherer-fisher community. The sheer number of burials showed that these people were not constantly on the move, as hunter-gatherers typically are. Analysis of organic remains in the bog revealed a rich surrounding ecosystem, which offered plentiful resources and allowed them to stay put for a time. Paleobotanists have identified 30 species of trees that existed around Windover. These include those typical of hardwood hammock and freshwater swamp, as well as pine woodland. These humid subtropical forests, which closely resemble forests in the area today, offered up more than 30 species of edible and/or medicinal plants. Berries and other soft fruits appear to have made up a large part of their diet. In one woman's stomach, or at least where her stomach had once been, the researchers discovered high concentrations of elderberry, nightshade, and holly. They speculate she may have been consuming copious amounts of a medicinal concoction made from these plants to fight the illness that eventually took her life. Windover was a community cemetery. The persons buried in the pond were almost exactly half female, half male, and while experts believe half of them were younger than 20 when they died, they think the rate of sub-adult mortality here was lower than that found in later, more complex societies. Moreover, some of the Windover folk lived into their 70s, a ripe old age for that time. The scientists' painstaking analyses, which remain ongoing almost 20 years after the excavation ended, have led to many additional discoveries. They know, for instance, that most bodies were buried within 48 hours of an individual's passing, because in hot, humid climates like Central Florida's, brain matter tends to liquefy quickly after death. The fact that 91 of the skeletons had intact brain masses suggests rapid interment. They also know that most burials took place in late summer and fall, roughly between July and October. They know this because the plant material they found associated with certain bodies, and which they conclude had constituted the person's last supper, are known through modern counterparts to become ripe for eating during those months of the year. They have also discovered, at least so far, no biological affiliation between these early Floridians and modern Native American groups. To protect the site for future generations, Dr. Glenn Doran and his team excavated only half of the pond. They then backfilled the remaining half with peat, leaving the rest of the ancient cemetery untouched, a quiet testament to America's prehistoric past, waiting for the technology of tomorrow to tell the rest of its story. One area of the investigation that has not yet borne fruit, on a par with its other successes, is the DNA work. DNA extraction and purification techniques could improve in the future. Waiting for techniques to improve is one reason why Doran and his colleagues decided to leave about half of the Windover site intact. In theory, somebody in 50 or 100 years could return to the pond, excavate untouched materials, and use newly developed techniques to learn more than scientists can today. Doran has said that the site now looks like any other Florida bog, and that one would never know anything was there, just as it was for over 7,000 years after the last body was cloaked in a shroud and staked down. Writing in his 2002 anthology about the site, he has said that his investigations at Windover were a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. He is sure that there are almost certainly other Windover-type sites in Florida, but whether or not another site will ever offer up so many of its secrets still remains to be seen. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed my documentary, don't forget to like and subscribe, and check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/World Chronicles.